A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
We have a really meaty one today. Daniel's prompt is asking us to look past the headlines about terrorist designations and actually dig into the legal and practical gears that turn behind the scenes. Specifically, he is curious about why some nations are moving to proscribe groups like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, while others are holding back, and how these groups manage to operate in what he calls the limelight before a designation hits.
I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been waiting for someone to ask about this because the divergence we are seeing right now in early 2026 is unlike anything we have seen in the last 20 years of counterterrorism policy. We're recording this on March 19, 2026, and the landscape has shifted beneath our feet just in the last month. We just had the European Union finally add the IRGC to its terrorist list back on February 19th, under Council Decision 2026/421, which was a massive shift. But as Daniel points out, the United Kingdom is still sitting on its hands, which creates this bizarre legal patchwork where a group can be a terrorist organization on one side of the English Channel and a legitimate state actor on the other.
It is a strange grey area. You mentioned that EU decision from February, and it feels like the culmination of years of pressure, especially from folks like the Israeli Foreign Minister Saar, who has been lobbying Brussels relentlessly. But for the average person, it just sounds like a label. People hear proscription and they think it is just the government saying, "We do not like these guys." What is the actual functional change when a group moves from being just a sanctioned entity to a proscribed terrorist organization?
The difference is the shift from administrative hurdles to outright criminalization. This is the core of the Limelight problem. When you are just under standard economic sanctions, it is mostly a banking headache. It means certain assets are frozen, and you cannot do business with specific individuals. But proscription under something like the UK Terrorism Act 2000 or the EU equivalent makes the very act of belonging to the group a crime. In the UK, for example, being a member can get you 10 years in prison. It also makes it a crime to invite support for the group, arrange meetings where a member speaks, or even wear clothing that suggests you are a supporter. It effectively creates a zone of total exclusion around the entity. Before that designation, you can have an office, you can have a spokesperson, and you can hold press conferences. You are operating in the limelight because the law hasn't yet drawn a circle around you and said everything inside this circle is radioactive.
So it is a legal quarantine. But that leads to Daniel's question about the limelight. If the IRGC has been operating in Europe for decades, and the US designated them as a foreign terrorist organization way back in April of 2019, what were they actually doing in the EU before this February designation? Were they just walking around in broad daylight?
They were doing exactly that, and it has been a major point of friction between Washington and Brussels for years. Before February 19, 2026, the IRGC could maintain diplomatic missions, engage in business contracts, and manage vast portfolios of front companies throughout Europe. They were operating in the limelight because, without that specific terrorist designation, EU member states lacked the domestic legal authority to seize their assets or arrest people simply for being part of the structure. They had to prove a specific crime like money laundering or espionage for every single action. Now, the burden of proof shifts. Just being an IRGC officer on EU soil is enough to trigger a legal response. The EU's move prohibits any EU operator from making funds or economic resources available to the group. It is a total freeze.
I can see why the UK position is becoming so controversial. We have seen over 550 UK lawmakers pushing for proscription, and there was that piece in Quillette just a few days ago called Half Measures on Iran that really took the Starmer government to task. It seems like the UK is becoming a bit of a safe harbor by default, which is a weird look for a country that prides itself on being tough on terror. But let's look at the other side of Daniel's prompt, the rebranding effect. If I am a group and I get proscribed, why don't I just change my name to the Sunshine and Rainbows Club and keep going?
That is the cat and mouse game that has defined the last 2 decades. The canonical example is the Al-Muhajirun network in the UK. They were proscribed back in 2006, but they just kept popping up under new names like Islam, for UK, Muslims Against Crusades, or Need for Khilafah. They had at least a dozen aliases. It took until 2024 to finally get a conviction against their leader, Anjem Choudhury, for directing a terrorist organization because the legal system had to keep playing catch-up with every new alias. He was essentially running the same group under different flags for nearly 20 years.
But surely the law has a way to deal with that now. You cannot just put a new coat of paint on a tank and call it a tractor.
Legislators eventually got wise to it. In the UK, under Section 36 of the Terrorism Act 2000, the Home Secretary has the power to issue what are called name change orders. This allows the government to declare that an alias is effectively the same thing as the proscribed group. So, if a group tries to rebrand, the Home Secretary can just sign a piece of paper saying, no, the Sunshine and Rainbows Club is actually Al-Muhajirun, and all the criminal penalties apply instantly without needing a new vote in Parliament. The UK currently has 79 organizations on its proscribed list, and many of those are just aliases for the same core groups. It is a much faster process than it used to be, but it still requires the government to be proactive.
That seems robust, but it still requires the government to be the one to initiate the order. If they are slow to issue the order, there is a window where the group can operate in a legal limbo. And that brings up a broader point about divergence. We're seeing a real fracturing of the Western consensus on these lists. For years, it felt like the US State Department's Foreign Terrorist Organization list was the gold standard that everyone else eventually mirrored. But lately, that is not happening.
We are seeing a complete breakdown of that traditional model. During the second Trump term, specifically in 2025, and moving into this year, the US State Department did the largest single expansion of the FTO list in history. They added 14 new groups, and 12 of those were Latin American criminal cartels. The US is now treating these cartels as terrorist organizations because of their insurgent-style tactics, their use of car bombs, and their direct threat to regional stability. But here is the kicker. Almost none of the US allies in Europe have followed suit. Canada partially followed by adding 7 of those cartels, but the EU and the UK are holding firm.
Why the hesitation? Is it just a different definition of what terrorism is?
It is a fundamental disagreement over the scope of the tool. The EU tends to view terrorism through the lens of political or ideological motives. They look at a cartel and see a highly organized criminal enterprise, but they do not necessarily see it as a terrorist group. They worry that if you expand the definition to include organized crime, you dilute the legal power of the designation. This creates what I call jurisdictional arbitrage. If you are a financier for a Mexican cartel, you might find your assets frozen in New York, but you can still move money through a bank in London or Frankfurt because, in those jurisdictions, you are just a criminal suspect, not a designated terrorist. The legal tools available to the police are completely different.
That arbitrage must be a nightmare for global finance. If you are a compliance officer at a major bank, you have to track 4 or 5 different lists that no longer agree with each other. And it is not just the cartels. Look at the Houthis, or Ansar Allah. The US redesignated them as a foreign terrorist organization in January of 2025, but the EU and the UK have a much more complicated relationship there because of the ongoing diplomatic efforts in Yemen.
The Houthi situation is a perfect example of the practical mess Daniel is asking about. When the US designates them, it triggers secondary sanctions. That means if a European shipping company pays a port fee to a Houthi-controlled harbor, they could be blocked from the US financial system. So even if the EU has not proscribed the Houthis, the US designation forces European companies to act as if they have. It is a form of legal extraterritoriality that drives European regulators crazy. It creates a situation where the US is effectively setting the trade policy for the rest of the world to its terrorist list.
It feels like the tool of prescription is getting dull because it is being used for so many different things. We used to reserve it for groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, where there was zero chance of ever sitting down at a table with them. But now we are talking about groups that actually govern territory. Which brings us to the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, paradox in Syria.
This is the live test case for everything we are talking about in 2026. HTS is the successor to Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. They did a very strategic rebrand in 2016, specifically to try and break that legal link to Al-Qaeda and stop Western airstrikes. They even changed their name twice in 2 years. Now, in early 2026, they are effectively the de facto government for a huge chunk of northwestern Syria and are part of the transitional government that emerged after the recent shifts in the civil war.
And they are still on almost every major terrorist list in the West. So how do you handle that? If you are a diplomat and you need to discuss a ceasefire or humanitarian aid with the people in charge of a city, but those people are members of a proscribed organization, you are technically committing a crime just by holding the meeting.
You have identified the exact legal wall that Western governments are hitting. In the UK, arranging or addressing a meeting that supports a proscribed group is a criminal offense. There is no carved-out exception for diplomats or aid workers in the primary legislation. What we are seeing now is a quiet, unofficial suspension of enforcement in some cases, which is a terrible way to run a legal system. It creates this atmosphere of uncertainty where an NGO might be terrified to provide food to a hospital because the hospital is in a district governed by HTS. The group is operating in the limelight as a government, while simultaneously being in the shadows as a terrorist entity.
I remember India raising this at the United Nations back in 2023. They were warning that terrorist groups were actually exploiting these humanitarian carve-outs. They argued the groups were rebranding themselves as NGOs, or using humanitarian front organizations to bypass sanctions. It is the ultimate rebranding move. You don't just change your name, you change your entire purpose on paper.
It is a sophisticated strategy. If you can convince the international community that you are a necessary provider of social services, you make it politically very difficult for them to keep you on a proscription list. We saw this with Hezbollah for years. They had a political wing and a social services wing that many countries tried to separate from their military wing. It was only recently that most Western nations realized that was a false distinction and moved to proscribe the entire entity. The IRGC is the ultimate version of this. They aren't just a group, they are a branch of the Iranian state. They have an intelligence wing, a massive business empire that controls a huge percentage of the Iranian economy, and a military wing.
When the EU proscribed them last month, they weren't just hitting a group of insurgents in the mountains. They were effectively declaring a significant part of the Iranian government to be a terrorist entity. That has to have massive ripple effects for European businesses.
The legal hurdle in the EU was that they needed a judicial decision from a national authority proving that the IRGC had been involved in a terrorist act on EU soil. Once they had that, the floodgates opened. But you are right, the implications are massive. It means that any business in Germany or France that has a contract with an Iranian company partially owned by the IRGC is now in a state of high legal risk. They have to unravel those connections or face asset freezes and criminal charges. This is why the UK is hesitating. The Foreign Office is terrified of the diplomatic fallout.
And meanwhile, the UK is still looking at the same evidence and saying, "We are not quite there yet." It makes you wonder what the threshold actually is. If over 550 MPs are saying the evidence is there and the EU has already crossed the bridge, what is the UK waiting for? Is it a fear of losing diplomatic channels, or is there a genuine legal disagreement?
It is likely a combination of both. The Foreign Office in the UK has traditionally been very protective of its ability to maintain a back channel to Tehran. They worry that if they proscribe the IRGC, Iran will respond by closing the UK embassy or arresting more dual nationals. It is a hostage-taking strategy by proxy. But the pressure is reaching a breaking point. When you have the Jewish Chronicle and other major outlets highlighting the UK's outlier status every week, the political cost of inaction eventually outweighs the diplomatic cost of proscription. The UK is currently the only major Western power that hasn't fully designated the IRGC.
It feels like the concept of proscription is moving from a tactical tool to a geopolitical statement. It is a way of saying you are no longer a legitimate participant in the international order. But if we cannot agree on who fits that description, the whole system starts to leak. Daniel's question about the Limelight is so sharp because that leakage is exactly where these groups thrive. They find the one jurisdiction that has not updated its list yet, and they move their money there.
The financial data backs that up. We see these massive spikes in capital flight from a jurisdiction right before a proscription order is finalized. These groups have excellent intelligence. They know when the EU Council is meeting. They know when the US State Department is preparing a briefing for Congress. By the time the asset freeze actually hits, the primary accounts are often already empty, and the money has been moved into a series of front companies or into jurisdictions like Turkey or the UAE that have different listing criteria. This is why the UN Security Council consolidated list is becoming less relevant.
Tell me more about that. Why is the UN list falling behind?
That list, based on Resolution 1267, is still primarily focused on Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It is a relic of the early 2000s. It requires a consensus of the permanent members of the Security Council to add anyone new. Can you imagine Russia or China agreeing with the US on a new list of terrorist organizations in the current geopolitical climate? It is never going to happen. So the UN list is basically frozen in time, while the national and regional lists are where the actual enforcement is happening. This guarantees more divergence. We are moving toward a world of blocks. You have the US bloc, the EU bloc, and then countries like China and Russia who have their own very different ideas about who is a terrorist.
So is proscription a failure? If they can just move the money and change the name, what are we actually accomplishing?
I would not call it a failure, but it is a blunt instrument in a world of scalpels. What it does accomplish is the long-term degradation of the group's ability to operate at scale. You can move a few $1 million through a front company, but you cannot run a multi-billion-dollar international procurement network for missile components if every major bank in Europe is looking for your signature. It forces these groups into the shadows, which makes everything they do more expensive and more difficult. It increases the friction of being a terrorist.
I like that phrase, the friction of being a terrorist. It is about making their lives harder, even if you cannot stop them entirely. But we also have to talk about the risk of overreach. When the US adds 12 Latin American cartels to the FTO list, are we stretching the definition of terrorism so far that it becomes meaningless?
That is the big debate in Washington right now. Critics argue that if everything is terrorism, then nothing is. If you use the same legal tools against a drug cartel in Sinaloa that you use against Al-Qaeda, you might end up clogging the courts and the intelligence agencies with so much data that you miss the next major ideological plot. But the counterargument is that the cartels are using car bombs, assassinating judges, and controlling territory. If that is not terrorism, what is? The US is essentially saying that the motive doesn't matter as much as the method.
It is the HTS problem again. We are seeing a blur between organized crime, insurgency, and governance, and our legal systems were designed for a world where those were three separate things. You were either a criminal, a rebel, or a state. Now, you can be all three at the same time. And for the individual or the business trying to navigate this, it is a minefield. We have to look at the second-order effects of this. If the UK continues to refuse to proscribe the IRGC, does that start to affect intelligence sharing within the Five Eyes or with the EU?
That is the most serious risk. If British intelligence has information on an IRGC plot in London, but they cannot use certain surveillance tools because the group isn't proscribed, that creates a hole in the collective defense of the West. Proscription is the only way to strip away the legal protections that these groups use to plot. It allows the state to say, you do not get to use our courts, our banks, or our freedom of assembly to plan violence. We covered some of that global campaign of unrest back in episode 1197, and it is a consistent pattern. These groups use the legal protections of Western democracies to plot the destruction of those very democracies.
It feels like we are at a turning point. The EU's move in February was a massive domino to fall. If the UK follows suit, it will create a unified Western front on the IRGC for the first time. But if they don't, the divergence will only grow. And then you have the wildcard of HTS in Syria. If a Western nation decides to deprescribe them because they are now a government, that would be an earthquake in counterterrorism law.
It would be the first time a group successfully rebranded its way off a list while still holding onto its core identity. It would provide a roadmap for every other group. Just hold enough territory, call yourself a transitional government, and wait for the West to get tired of the legal fight. It is a strategy of attrition. We should keep a very close eye on how the HTS case is handled in the next 6 months. It is the litmus test for the future of proscription.
It is a lot to take in. Daniel really opened a door here into a world that most people only see through the lens of political slogans. But the reality is a complex web of name change orders, jurisdictional arbitrage, and diplomatic tightrope walking.
I think the big takeaway for me is that proscription is no longer a static list. It is a live, evolving battlefield. The groups are getting better at hiding, and the laws are getting more aggressive at finding them. But as long as there is a gap between how London, Brussels, and Washington see the world, there will always be a limelight for these groups to operate in.
We should probably wrap it up there before we get too deep into the weeds of EU administrative law. Though I know you could go for another 3 hours on Council Decision 2026/421.
I have the full text right here if you change your mind.
I will pass for now, but it is a fascinating look at the gears of power. If you want to dig deeper into the Middle East side of this, we did a deep dive on the collapse of Iranian proxies in episode 1200 that really complements this discussion.
That one is definitely worth a listen to see how the kinetic side of this connects to the legal side we talked about today.
This has been My Weird Prompts. A huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly.
And big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do it without them.
If you are finding these deep dives helpful, a quick review on your podcast app of choice really helps us reach more people who are looking for substance over sound bites.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the show.
We will be back soon with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep digging deeper.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.